By the time the military police truck found the track that climbed into the Vosges foothills, the war in Europe was over. Berlin had fallen. The camps had been opened. Across France, American units were being counted, sorted and pushed toward home. Men who had expected to die in orchards and shell holes were suddenly arguing about ships and discharge papers. On a ruined farm above a muddy road, one American sat inside a collapsed barn and looked at a letter he still had not stopped carrying. His name was Karl Ellis. He was not the kind of man the army liked to photograph. He had no neat enlistment story, no clean heroic label, no simple path from training field to victory. 4 years earlier, he had been a civilian welder at Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, a quiet man who could cut and brace steel better than he could explain himself. Then the harbor had exploded, another man had died in front of him, and a letter had been pushed into his hand before the blood cooled. By the autumn of 1945, the paper had been soaked in salt water, sweat, rain, and other men's blood. Half of it had been burned away. Only one name could still be read with certainty. Rose. Karl turned the envelope over in his hands while the truck climbed toward him. It was coming to collect him. After months of paperwork, the army had finally straightened his status enough to release him into the machinery of repatriation. That should have ended the matter. It did not. He sat beneath broken rafters and stared at the warped paper as if it still required something more. Outside, the engine grew louder. The sound carried him backward. In the autumn of 1941, Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard ran on heat, metal, and routine. Welders climbed scaffolds before sunrise. Riveters hammered plates into place. Foremen moved from hull to hull with clipboards and coffee. Karl fit that world because it asked from him what he could supply. He worked, ate, slept, and returned the next day. He was broad-shouldered, slow to speak, and more comfortable with damaged steel than with undamaged people. The men around him read that in different ways. Some trusted him because he was steady. Some laughed at him because steadiness looks dull next to louder men. A foreman once told him he was built for a welding torch, not a rifle. Karl did not argue. He had no hunger for uniforms or stories about glory. He understood repair. He understood how stress traveled through a seam, how one bad joint failed later under weight that looked manageable at first. People, he suspected, obeyed similar laws. The only man in the yard who regularly asked Karl for more than labor was Tommy Bonelli. Tommy came from Brooklyn, talked fast, laughed easily, and treated every break in the day as if it had been invented for coffee. He wrote badly. That was where Karl came in. On lunch breaks, Tommy would hand him paper, dictate some awkward message to a woman named Rose, then ask Karl to make it sound like somebody worth waiting for had written it. Karl, who hated speaking about himself, found that he did not mind arranging another man's feelings into sentences that could travel. Tommy turned that habit into meaning. One day, he showed Karl a photograph of Rose folded into his wallet, and said that a man who could write love letters for someone else had a better chance of surviving a war than a man who kept testing whether fate was paying attention. Karl asked why. Tommy laughed and said men like Karl kept people alive, while men like Tommy usually went looking for trouble. It sounded like a joke, but Karl carried it away with him. On December the 6th, Tommy received a reply. He came into the bunkhouse with the envelope in his hand, grinning like a man who had already started spending happiness he did not yet fully possess. He wanted Karl to read it aloud the next day after shift. Karl told him it could wait. Tommy said there was no reason to wait for anything anymore. At 7:55 the next morning, Japanese aircraft came in low enough to turn sound into impact. Pearl Harbor did not at first understand what it was hearing. Then ships began to burn. Fuel caught on water. Men fell from scaffolds and decks. In the yard there was no clean line between military and civilian, only confusion and immediate choice. Karl ran out of the bunkhouse into a world already losing its shape. Other men were diving for walls or ditches. He turned the other way because he saw a yard worker pinned beneath a twisted sheet of steel near a service track. The man was still alive. That decided it. Karl slid beside the wreckage, set his torch to work and cut through the buckled plate while bombs were falling somewhere beyond the sheds. Karl hauled him out, threw him over his shoulders, and carried him through smoke toward the nearest cluster of wounded. He got one man clear. Every minute spent doing that was a minute he was not spending looking for Tommy. By the time Karl fought back toward the quarters, the area there had already been sorted by blast and fire. Men stumbled past him, black with soot. Corpsmen shouted for stretchers, morphine, hands, anything. Somebody told him the wounded had been moved toward a storage room being used as a dressing station. He found Tommy there on a cot too low to the floor because there had not been room to do better. One side of Tommy's body was soaked through. Even then, his hand kept working at his own pocket. Karl helped him. What came out was the letter from the day before, blood-stained and crushed. Tommy pushed it against Karl's chest and managed to say Rose's name and Brooklyn. There may have been more. If there was, the room swallowed it. Karl leaned closer, but Tommy was already leaving faster than language could follow. That was how the task began. Not with a full address or a proper promise, but with one name, one city, and a dead man who had not had enough breath to finish explaining himself. Karl kept the letter because there was nothing else to do. By the end of that day, Pearl Harbor's paperwork was ash, smoke, or confusion soaked in seawater. Civilian rosters and casualty lists blurred into each other. In the months that followed, the war reached even those who had not intended to feed it. Karl's welding skill kept him useful, but usefulness is not safety. He was moved through emergency labor details, transport assignments, repair detachments, and finally into the Army's replacement chain so loosely that nobody ever explained the transition cleanly, and nobody later seemed able to reverse it. He tried once to mail the letter. The clerk asked for a full address. Karl had only Brooklyn and Rose. The envelope came back across the desk. The easy path ended there. So the letter went with him when he boarded a transport for North Africa in late 1942. Around him were men with cleaner reasons for being on that ship. Infantry replacements, drivers, engineers, officers with maps they only half trusted. Karl belonged to none of their tidy categories. He learned quickly that the Army could use a man without being fully able to account for him. Later, if later came, would be someone else's problem. He hit the beach near Oran under shellfire during Operation Torch. Landing craft jammed. Men spilled into shallow water and bad luck. Karl did what he always did when chaos broke the frame. He looked for the nearest person who could still be saved. A lieutenant had been hit and half buried behind wrecked crates. Karl dragged him clear and hauled him toward a line of rocks that offered slightly less exposure than the open sand. The officer lived. Someone above him now knew his face and attached it to utility. Later, in the wrecked edge of the city, Karl found a chaplain moving among the wounded. He took out the letter and asked the only practical question he knew how to ask. How did a man get from North Africa to Brooklyn? The chaplain answered in the plain language the front forced on everyone. First, you stay alive through Africa, then Italy, then France. After that, you can think about Brooklyn. The chaplain meant comfort. Karl heard instruction. He accepted it that way. In Tunisia, the formula worked because the front still moved. Karl did not hunt targets. He hauled the wounded out of bad ground, cut jammed hatches, patched ruptured lines, and repaired whatever threatened to strand other people in places where shells were still landing. Men in his unit began calling him the Welder, partly because he had once been one, and partly because he seemed able to force broken things into temporary obedience. The letter changed with him. Whenever the line paused, Karl wrote on the back of the envelope. Dates, crossroads, villages, the names of places crossed while still carrying Tommy's last errand. He was not keeping a military record. He was proving continuity. If units thinned and men vanished, the envelope could still say that Karl Ellis had moved from one end of the war to another without dropping what had been put into his hand. In Sicily, the habit hardened. During a night advance, a Sherman supporting his section threw a track and died in the wrong place. Engineers were nowhere near. Dawn was coming. Karl found tools, crawled under bad light with 2 mechanics, and helped force the damaged metal back into cooperation. The tank rolled again at first light and later helped break a position pinning down the platoon. An officer put Karl's name forward for recognition. Karl refused the attention. When asked what he wanted instead, he said he needed to get to Brooklyn. Men laughed. He meant it. So the months lengthened and the role fixed around him. Karl became known not for killing, but for remaining useful after other men had spent themselves. That gave him a narrow sort of protection. Officers hesitated to waste him. Men went looking for him when machinery failed, or bodies had to be dragged out of exposed places. But the more dependable Karl became, the easier it was for everyone, including Karl, to mistake endurance for stability. That illusion lasted until Anzio. Anzio changed the terms. North Africa and Sicily had been hard, but they had moved. Anzio sat under observation and punishment. Men who had measured danger in minutes now measured it in repetition. Shells came in breakfast, sleep and mud. Cover filled, collapsed, and filled again. Water rotted socks, tempers and thought. A man could survive there for days and still feel he had advanced nowhere except deeper into exhaustion. Karl kept working because work was the only structure left. He hauled men out of flooded holes, cut stretchers free from wrecked vehicles, and fixed whatever the front had not yet managed to destroy completely. But Anzio began to break the old bargain. Rescue no longer ended anything. A man dragged clear in the morning could be dead by afternoon. Action still produced result, but result no longer held long enough to feel trustworthy. His notes on the envelope grew shorter. There was less time. There was also less faith that dates and place names still described a road. One night, after too little sleep and too much shelling, Karl lay in a shell hole, with water seeping under him, and discovered that his body had gone on without consulting his mind. He could not remember his last full meal. He only knew that the section had taken losses and that the newest replacement among them was little more than a frightened boy under a helmet. After midnight, the Germans came in the way men at Anzio feared most. Not as distant artillery, but as nearby movement where there should have been none. A scrape, a whisper, a shape crossing a gap in wire. Someone hissed a warning. The young replacement froze. His rifle hung useless while 2 German scouts slipped toward the trench line. Karl saw the distance vanish and understood that if no one acted, the trench would belong to whoever hesitated least. He grabbed an M1 and fired twice. Both figures dropped in the mud. The trench held. The cost came at once. Karl shoved the rifle away almost immediately and crawled to the replacement, who had folded in on himself against the trench wall. Karl dragged him upright and moved him rearward while the section reformed around the dead and the dark. In a few seconds, he had done 2 things he had spent years treating as separate kinds of action. He had killed in order to rescue. The result was simple. The line survived. The consequence was that something in him stopped trying to keep those categories apart. Men noticed the change before Karl named it. He still went where the wounded were. He still worked, but his face carried distance now. He answered orders and forgot conversations. He slept in fragments and woke already exhausted. The letter remained in his pocket, but it no longer felt like a path. It felt like a weight. That was when the military police inquiry reached him. It began as administration, which is often more dangerous than hostility because it can erase a man without needing to dislike him. A sergeant reviewing personnel discrepancies noticed that Karl's trail back to Pearl Harbor had too many gaps. Shipyard civilian, emergency attachment, transfer, field replacement, missing original file, burned records, Incomplete enlistment documentation. Karl had been useful at every stage and properly anchored at none. The sergeant questioned him in dugouts and beside trucks. Karl answered what he could. He had worked in the yard. He had survived the attack. He had been moved where needed. He belonged with the men beside him because he had bled where they bled. That was true in practice and thin on paper. The sergeant explained, not unkindly, that if the war ended before the record was repaired, Karl might become difficult to process, difficult to ship, difficult even to classify. The army had a genius for making men disappear in two directions at once, physically in battle, administratively in files. Karl listened and asked whether the sergeant had ever heard of a woman named Rose in Brooklyn. It was not insolence. It was hierarchy. In Karl's mind, the letter still ranked above his own legal existence. The inquiry never ripened into action while the front still needed bodies. Karl remained because no one had a better immediate use for him elsewhere. But the investigation left its mark. It told him that even if he survived, he might step out of the war into a limbo where the government that had spent him could ask who he was supposed to be. That was why the letter changed again. It was no longer only Tommy's last request. It was the last object Karl possessed that linked him to continuity, loyalty, and purpose all at once. When the beachhead finally broke and the road toward Rome opened under savage cost, Karl moved with the column like everyone else. Burnt vehicles lined the roads. Walls had been ripped open by armor. During one convoy movement north, German 88s found the road where it narrowed through exposed ground. The lead vehicles went first and turned the rest into a trap. Karl went where the flames were because he always did. He dragged one man from under a bent door, another out of a ditch, a third whose sleeve had caught fire. Then he heard pounding from a cargo truck that had been hit but had not yet fully ignited. He climbed into smoke thick enough to blind him, got a fourth man by the straps, and shoved him out toward the road. That should have been enough. Instead, Karl turned back once more because movement deeper inside suggested someone else might still be alive. On the front, hope and compulsion often look identical for the first seconds. The truck detonated before the third. He woke later among medics with bandages on his chest and ash in his throat. His first clear thought was not pain. It was his pocket. He found the letter still there, but half of it had burned away. The lower portion of the envelope, where the most useful information had been, was gone. Whatever fuller clue Tommy might once have given had been erased in heat. Only the upper section remained, blackened at the edge, with the name Rose still visible. Karl understood the practical meaning at once. A city had already been too little. A first name was almost nothing. He got to his knees beside the road and made the sound men make when some inner support snaps under a load it can no longer distribute. He had spent years turning survival into a route. The explosion had just removed the last signpost. He had saved 4 men and lost the address. From then on, Karl changed in ways even strangers could read. He still moved toward the wounded. He still repaired what could be repaired. But the actions seemed to contain less choice. He performed them with the emptiness of a mechanism that had outlived the instructions that once justified its motion. When Operation Dragoon carried him into southern France in August 1944, he went ashore under another sky and another set of guns. He said nothing about any of it. The push north through the Rhone Valley and toward the Vosges only deepened the effect. Roads narrowed. Forests absorbed sound and returned it altered. Villages looked less captured than abandoned by whatever had once made ordinary life possible. Karl moved through that landscape, carrying a burned letter and a face that no longer seemed fully inhabited. In one village near the mountains, he crossed paths with an elderly woman working with the local resistance. She had the hard, exact look of someone who had survived occupation by wasting no attention. Karl was helping move 2 wounded men into a stone outbuilding when she stopped him. She had noticed what others had, that his eyes did not settle where his body did. Karl took out the ruined letter, almost without knowing why. The woman looked at the paper, then at the man carrying it, and said with the simplicity of someone too old for delicacy that he was not looking for a woman. He was looking for the friend who had died before he could save him. Karl did not answer, because the answer had already landed. Rose had become more symbol than person long before. The true cargo was Tommy's death, the unfinished exchange at the aid station, and the conviction that a man might justify outliving another man by carrying his last obligation farther than any official system ever would. The resistance woman had only removed disguise. By the spring of 1945, Germany was collapsing in the ugly, broken fashion empires usually choose when denied dignity. Roads clogged with displaced people. Columns fell apart. Prisoners emerged from places not built to let people emerge. Karl's unit crossed into areas where the war no longer looked like campaigns on maps, but like the residue of policy, transport, hunger, and neglect. In one such sector near the border, they found a small concentration camp too late to call the discovery anything but partial rescue. Karl entered because men like him always entered first when there were bodies to move. Water, blankets, space. The living sorted from the dying. Interpreters trying to reconnect names to places beyond the wire. He worked through the barracks with the same numb precision he had used everywhere else, but the place forced something new upon him. Here was suffering for which no battlefield explanation was adequate. Here were people reduced not by chance shelling or bad maneuver, but by design. Names began to circulate once the survivors had enough strength to answer questions. One of the women, older than the photograph Tommy had once shown him, and older than any image Karl had unknowingly preserved, gave a name that caught him where years of noise had not. Rose. He crossed the yard with the caution of a man approaching what might still prove to be another cruel coincidence. She sat on a crate outside a barrack wall, wrapped in an army blanket, her face thin to the bone beneath it. Karl took out the letter. For a second he did not know how to speak, because every version of this meeting he had ever imagined belonged to a younger woman in another country. He held out the envelope instead. Rose looked at it, and what changed in her face was not surprise at the name, but recognition of the hand. Even burned, even stained, the writing was enough. She touched the front with 2 fingers and closed her eyes once, as if the years between writing and delivery had crossed her all at once. Karl expected relief or grief in some form he could understand. What he received was correction. Tommy, she said when water and translation made speech possible, had been her brother, not her fiancé. He had used the easier fiction when talking to men because it required less explanation, and because barracks conversations preferred sweethearts to family burdens. The letter had not been a love note. It had been family news, the hardest kind to send from far away. Their mother had died. Tommy had been writing to tell Rose before the news reached her by some colder route or never reached her at all. The truth rearranged 4 years in minutes. Karl had carried the letter across Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, and into Germany, believing he was preserving a dead man's romance. In fact, he had been carrying a death notice, written by one child of a family to another. The difference mattered because it returned the story to the harsher economy war usually keeps. People did not only lose sweethearts, they lost mothers, brothers, addresses, and the chance to tell each other in the right order. Tommy had died trying to preserve sequence in a world built on smashing sequence beyond repair. Rose explained the rest in pieces. After the United States entered the war, her own life had not remained in Brooklyn, as Tommy had let others assume. Through family movement, work, and necessity, she had ended up tied to resistance work in occupied France. Eventually, she had been arrested and pushed through the machinery that ended here. A letter about one death had arrived at a place built from countless others, carried by a man who had stayed alive only because he refused to let the first one become ordinary. Karl listened and discovered that the final burden of the mission was not disappointment that Rose had turned out to be someone else. It was that the mission had succeeded without releasing him. The wrong story had sustained him, but the right story did not free him. Tommy had not chosen Karl because Karl was the most efficient courier. He had chosen him because Karl was the one man nearby who would not throw family grief aside when the world told him to care only about military priorities. Rose seemed to understand that before Karl did. She thanked him not because the information was still useful. By 1945, the news in the letter was old sorrow, but because he had proved Tommy had not vanished cleanly into the war's anonymous consumption of men. He had been remembered by a friend. Someone had carried his last unfinished act across the map. Files could burn, bodies could disappear, totals could swallow names. Yet one welder with a scorched envelope had kept a single thread from being cut. That should have completed Karl's obligation. In a practical sense, it did. But completion often reveals what duty had hidden. Once Rose had read what remained and placed the letter back in his hands, Karl found he had no immediate next motion. For years he had organized fear, pain, and uncertainty under one heading. Keep moving until the letter is delivered. Delivery removed the heading. Under it waited everything he had delayed feeling. Pearl Harbor, Tommy's dying hand, the trench at Anzio, the burning truck, the possibility that his own government still did not know exactly what to call him. Karl saw Rose only once more before his unit was sent west for demobilization review. She survived, which in that season qualified as a triumph stripped nearly bare of joy. She still had the letter then, but when she learned he was leaving, she pressed it back into his hand. He tried to refuse. She insisted. The paper, she said, had reached her. What remained belonged to the man who had carried it. That changed the object one last time. It was no longer a task. It was evidence. So the story returned to the barn in the Vosges in the autumn after victory. The military police truck came because the long administrative tangle around Karl's status had finally produced a usable answer. Men who had once questioned whether he existed in the proper form now had enough signatures to send him home. That was the official result. The consequence was stranger. Karl was being returned to a country he had left first as a shipyard worker, then as something the army used without ever naming clearly, and now as a survivor carrying proof of another man's unfinished family duty. The MPs called his name. Karl stood slowly beneath the broken roof and looked once more at the letter. It had crossed the Pacific on his chest, the beaches of Algeria in his tunic, the hills of Tunisia, the dust of Sicily, the mud of Anzio, the roads to Rome, the landings in southern France, the forests of the Vosges, and the wire of a camp in collapsing Germany. It had begun as another man's errand. It had ended as the map of Karl's own transformation. He did not put it back into his pocket. Instead, he reached up to a splintered beam where part of the roof still held and tucked the envelope into a crack in the wood above eye level. The gesture was small and workmanlike. Karl had never trusted grand ones. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, he left the paper somewhere other than on his own body. Without it against his chest, he felt how little of the intervening years belonged to ordinary life. Then he walked out to the truck. He did not look back. Down beyond the rutted field, an American flag moved above a base area where men were being assembled and sent toward ships. It represented home, victory, and procedure, the large words nations prefer after blood has already been spent. Karl saw something narrower. The last receiver of the letter had never been Rose alone. It had also been him. He had carried the message so long that in the end he was the one forced to open it fully. Not only the family death inside it, but the larger notice the war had been delivering all along. Survival was not the opposite of loss. It was the condition under which loss kept being read. When the truck pulled away from the farm, it carried a man the army could finally account for. It did not carry all that had happened to him. Those remains stayed behind in many places: the harbour, the beaches, the shell holes, the convoy road, the campyard, the barn beam. But one thing had changed. Karl was no longer moving because a dead friend had given him direction. He was moving because the errand had ended and there was nothing left to hide behind. That was not peace. It was only the first honest mile after years of borrowed purpose. For a man like Karl Ellis, it was the closest thing to an ending. The war was willing to give,